And now I hand over back to my colleague Iddo Moed for the next panel. Please.
Thank you very much. So we move on to the multilateral approach panel. And for this, I have the pleasure and the honor to invite the following speakers to the stage. Mr. Chris Painter, who is globally recognized leader and expert on cybersecurity, cyber policy and combating cybercrime. He's been, among many other things, the coordinator for cybersecurity at the State Department. Mr. Alexander Klimburg, who is Associate and former Research Fellow of the Science and Technology and Public Policy Program and Cybersecurity Project at Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center. He's also Program Director at the Hague Center for Security Studies and a non-resident Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, and recently published the Darkening Web. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Dr. Kanwal Sibal joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1966, eventually serving as the Foreign Secretary of India from July 2002 to November 2003. And Ambassador Masato Ohtaka, he's the Deputy Assistant Minister, Deputy Director General at the Foreign Policy Bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. He's also the Ambassador in charge of UN Affairs and Ambassador in charge of cyber policy. So, good afternoon, gentlemen. I must say it's a bit unfortunate. We're only gentlemen. We need to have more women here. That's just a fact, unfortunately. So we are talking about the multilateral approach, and each and every one of you has a different perspective and approach to what we consider the joint effort, sometimes universal, sometimes like-minded effort of countries and organizations to create more stability and create more order in cyberspace. So before posing questions, I would like to have each of you's perspectives on this topic. Chris, why don't you start?
Thank you. Thank you, and it's really been good to be back at, in Israel and here for CyberWeek. I'm sorry we can't spend more time engaging in sort of this Talmudic, what did Jim really mean, view of the world, but you know, Jim is still here, he's still alive too. So. This issue of, you know, a couple of observations. This issue of multilateral and is multilateral versus bilateral. And it's interesting, at this conference last year, Tom Bossert from the White House talked about a move away from multilateral toward bilateral. And I think that's really kind of a false choice, because multilateral is not coextensive with the UN. The UN is one multilateral body, to be sure, but multilateral, I think, encompasses a broader set of institutions. It could be regional institutions like OAS, APEC, EU, OSCE, others. It could be loose, informal groups of countries that are, by their nature, multilateral. And you know, having worked at the State Department for 6.5 years, the fact is multilateral always begins with bilateral. Bilateral is a building block to multilateral. You have bilateral discussions in a way to build those coalitions of countries, whether they be in those larger multilateral organizations or like-minded groups of countries. You know, and then I also think you have to ask, well, multilateral for what? What are you trying to achieve? So there are a couple of different things. One, when we're talking about, you know, rules of the road, norms of behavior, stability frameworks, there's been, and also the deal we reached with China, which Chris also talked about, there was, I thought, you know, a very important aspect of getting larger acceptance of those norms, or larger acceptance of those particular issues. Now, with the China agreement, it began with a bilateral agreement between the US and China. It then became a G20 statement. It then became a number of serial bilateral agreements after that, which created a norm on the theft of intellectual property. Now, putting aside, you know, whether or not that's actually resulted in substantial differences, and I think it had originally, but there's some rethinking now. I think that's one model. Another is in the UNGG, where we were able to reach consensus with countries who didn't really agree on a lot of things. You had China and Russia there, and the advantage of having a larger consensus with a larger group of countries is that when you have that, it creates an accountability. Even if those countries, when they agree, may not, you can argue, well, they're not going to actually do these things either. They're not going to follow this. They're just agreeing for the sake of agreeing. It creates an accountability mechanism where the like-minded countries can call out countries who, in fact, transgress what those norms are. So again, I think there's advantage of that. However, when you're talking about further work in this area, because certainly the GG, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, is sort of went aground this last time. A lot of consensus before, but I think had reached a limit where there wasn't consensus among some of the larger players. Doesn't mean there's not more work that can be done and more progress that can be made, but there clearly is major differences. So then I think, even with respect to norms and rules of the road, you can still have a lot of work among like-minded partners to come up with ideas of what they think is acceptable and to try to move that forward. And there's lots of analogs in the past. Smaller groups like the G8, when it was the G8, now the G7, have been crucibles for bringing work forward, even in the cyber area, that have provided those models, and you can get some acceptance that way. So that's one idea. The other is when you talk about, well, before I move to enforcement, the other is, other organizations have, besides the states have a role in that too. So, you have these multilateral bodies, which as a rule don't usually include other than state stakeholders. So you have other stakeholders, private sector, civil society, others who have a stake in this issue. They may not be driving the international security discussion as much because normally that is negotiations between states, but they certainly have views and they have ways forward. One of the things that many of us, as you mentioned, are here for is our Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. That is a good multi-stakeholder organization that's trying to contribute to this, for instance. So there are different roles you can have. Now, the other aspect is when you're talking about rules enforcement. So a lot of people have criticized the idea of norms or even the stability structure because they say, well, what good are norms? They're just not worth the paper they're written on if there is no consequences for violating those norms. And I talked about this a little bit at this conference last year when we talked in the main session last year. I think we have to actually have some costs and consequences for people, for states who are violating the norms. And I think we've made some progress this last year where we've had collections of countries, not universally, not like the UN condemning an action, but you've had collections of countries who've come out and attributed various conduct, like North Korea and WannaCry, Russia with respect to NotPetya. That's a very good move. I think getting more countries to do that and come out and publicly say it, that's not an easy thing to do, and I think it's really important. And so you have collections of countries, collections of like-minded countries doing that. There are a lot of issues that are problematic in that and sharing information to allow that. There's a lot of things that have to be overcome, but I think that's really good. But you're not going to really name and shame Russia or China, and they're not going to really change their behavior, or Russia or North Korea. I think China actually does care about soft power more than Russia does now. And I think one of the reasons we're able to reach an agreement with China is they do care about this, and they want to be seen as responsible players, where Russia and North Korea, I think, at least to this date, have not. So, or Russia increasingly not. So having consequences for those actions is important. Simply calling them out without any further consequence, or one that's actually tailored to them to make a difference, is, I think, problematic. And that there again, yes, you can pursue multilateral bodies, but I think that's going to be less in the short term effective. But getting a small group of countries together to work together to not only attribute conduct but to impose appropriate consequences, I think is important. Now, one thing I've talked about in the past and others of my colleagues have is the idea of proliferation security initiative analog to this. It's not the exact proliferation security initiative, it's simply using that as a model. And the idea is countries come together and work informally. It's not a formalized group, it's not like a treaty organization, but it's a number of countries who can come together. And that might be different countries in each instance, but they have a like-minded view to promote stability in cyberspace. And they will use different tools that they might have they might use collective tools together, or they might use different tools to try to impose appropriate costs on bad state actors and get them really to change their behavior into the future. Now, that, again, there's lots of issues with that. There's issues of escalation control. I agree with Jim. I agree with what I think Jim said, which is that escalation control, I think, is often overstated. And I think one of the things you can have is diplomatic messaging, even with a country who's doing bad things, to say, hey, we're doing this too, and that can help control escalation, just like it does in the physical world. So there are ways to do that. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think another is then giving folks an off-ramp, that if they're doing something bad, and you impose a consequence on them, or several, and some seen and unseen, but I think some have to be seen, that you have a way of them doing it. But we haven't been very effective. As a global community, I think we've been very ineffective in doing that with any regularity or anything that actually has imposed true cost. So that's a challenge going in the future. The last thing I'll just mention, because you asked me to, was some of the performance indexes for this. And I think it's really some of the baseline things, like, are we changing behavior? Are we improving information sharing to allow us to act more collectively? I think it's important. I don't think, I think this is not something that gets solved overnight. I think the fact we've gotten some traction on things like some of the stability framework is important, but getting more countries to sign up, I think it's important. And I also would shy away from, I like the effects-based test. What kinds of conduct are we trying to prevent from happening? Like the norms that we came up with, like don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime. Wartime, the rules are different, but a lot of the activities are really below that threshold of an armed conflict. So what are the ways that we can appropriately do that, rather than focusing on cyber weapons? And I think that one of the things I've seen some people talk about is, hey, we should have a cyber weapon treaty. Hey, Wassenaar is a great way to deal with this, and that really wasn't, as we all found out. So we have to think about proliferation, I think, in new ways, but we're really talking about conduct and effects. And with that, I'll stop, because I think I've finished my 7 minutes.
So thank you, and it's great to be here. It's my first time at this conference. I hope it won't be the last. From my point of view as a historian, we're having a very special anniversary, and I don't mean the founding of the State of Israel. I mean it's 20 years since a lot of things happened in cyberspace. So 1998 was effectively the beginning of the definition of information operations in the US, JP 313. It was also the publishing of the Presidential Decision Directive 63, which is the first document that effectively announced critical infrastructure protection. It also is the setup of ICANN, and it was also the first year that Russia submitted a resolution to the UN General Assembly on ICT and information security. And they've kept on going, that same resolution, for 20 years with remarkable persistency, with slight modifications, but always, in my mind, towards the same end, which is effectively to support the multilateral claim on deciding all matters of internet policy rather than the existing multi-stakeholder model. And this is what I think we should come and reflect on. So the UN Group of Governmental Experts process, which was initiated as a result of Russian persistence, has been very effective in accomplishing some very important things. So a small leap was taken that was very effective. That, of course, is implementing not only the principle of non-binding, non-legally binding norms, rules of the road, and also empowering regional organizations to take up the challenge of developing confidence-building measures that are practical implementations of these norms. That's great. What was less great, however, was that it also has slowly, at least in my mind, underlined the Russian and Chinese claim that multilateral agreements should be the answer to all of the internet's problems. And that is probably one of the decisive problems of the current UNGGE affiliated process. There are other problems, the ones that Chris just talked about beforehand, that norms are, of course, not adhered to. Just a couple of months after we agreed on the norm not to interfere with critical infrastructure absent wartime, the Ukrainian power grid went down, at least in part. They could argue that it didn't go down in total. It might be considered a wartime situation. There are many other excuses you can make. But in point of fact, all of the norms that we have agreed upon have been violated. Now, some of Chris's colleagues would say that's a good thing. A violation of a norm helps us understand what the violation of a norm is, what a norm actually is. But too many violations of a norm will render that norm useless. And I think that gets us to the second problem, is that enough stakeholders are not actually buying in to the entire process. I don't mean states. Many states were not part of the UNGGE process to begin with, and therefore the UNGGE has steadily expanded its membership, making the point that it's been rather difficult for it to reach consensus on some issues. I'm also referring to the fact that other stakeholders, such as the private sector and the civil society, which do play a rather important role, most things related to the internet, don't feel that they've been having a say. And that means they come out with some rather grandiose plans, such as, for instance, Geneva Convention for Cyberspace or other notions, because they are not happy with progress so far. And that sometimes, must be said, is a justifiable grievance. We have not really achieved probably what many people set out to achieve when the GGE process started in 2005 was the first GGE. There is a silver lining to all this. So Joe Nye has repeatedly pointed out that if we look back to the Cold War period, it took many decades for states to develop the instruments to be able to adjust to the advent of nuclear weapons. And he's also pointed out that in cyber terms, or nuke terms, we're probably around the 1960s and 1970s in terms of international diplomacy. We're still figuring out how this works. So Professor Wolfgang Kleinwächter, who is also here, although not in this room at this moment, developed a model where he looked back at some of those arms control processes in the 1970s and decided that some of the things that were done then to great effect could be applied now. That includes, first of all, having, of course, so this refers to the Conference of Security Cooperation in Europe, which later became the OSCE. So some of those principles applied then could perhaps also work now. That includes, for instance, the legally non-binding nature of the agreements that were undertaken in this context. They were politically binding, but not legally binding. The principle of effectively using the norms that existed, in this case the UN Charter, and not developing a whole set of new norms. It was also allowed a wide array of stakeholders to participate, which was also an issue that was a challenge at that time between the major powers. And finally, and most importantly, it created baskets of different issues that could be negotiated side by side. In this context, in the context of the 1960s and 1970s, it was the principle of having conventional forces in Europe discussions side by side with human rights discussions. Today, it's about international peace and security discussions side by side with internet governance discussions. The problem in the West is that we rightly don't want to have these two things mingled together. That would be a disaster if we lost control of that process. On the other hand, Russia and China, and also many countries in between, for instance, Brazil and India and others, want to talk about issues of representation and content and similar. And we have to have some kind of avenue to engage with them rather than tying it all in one ball of wax and making it subject to the UN First Committee. So, in conclusion, as an academic, I don't really find neo-realist models of international relations very appealing. I don't really like balance of power as a general framework. However, it does kind of apply here. And if you want to apply a balance of power framework to cyber stability, to try to find a way in which we are going to have some type of stable environment going forward, and not one relying on mutual assured destruction, then we basically have to accept what Kissinger would said was the principle that all of us need to be somewhat unhappy. We have to make compromises somewhere to get progress. If we don't make some compromises and all become a little bit unhappy, we're all going to become very unhappy pretty soon.
Well, thank you. I have attended some conferences where people have cautioned against bringing the arms control model into discussions on cyberspace. And I think there may be some merit in that cautioning. Because access to nuclear weapons, missile technologies is very difficult, is technologically extremely complex. Very few countries can master that, and it's very expensive. Whereas cyberspace is now accessible to all, everybody is participating in it. And the more we go into the Internet of Things and everything else, all our lives are going to be governed by cyberspace. So if we then think about only security and bringing the arms control model, then we would be, to my mind, making a mistake. There is no option but to give primacy to multilateral approaches. However slow they may be, however frustrating they may be at times, if you want to have durable, long-lasting agreements, you have to develop as deep an international consensus as possible. And then there are some obvious contradictions in the approach that some countries have. On the one hand, you don't want the internet to be fractured. You want it to remain seamless. You want to make sure that everybody has access to it equally, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you then go into a process by which you try to start controlling things and controlling them through the threat of sanctions, etc., etc., then you are actually dealing with the two contradictory impulses. So you have to find a rational middle of the way solution with regard to this. And therefore, cartels like NSG or MTCR or Wasana or whatever, which worked effectively with regard to nuclear weapons, advanced technology, missile technology, I don't think will work when it comes to cyberspace. And then, of course, there are many technical issues that are involved in discussing this whole problem about cyber weapons, cyber attacks, and everything else. And I don't have to tell such a well-informed audience about these, the attribution being one of the most difficult issues. And then you can't, unless you're very clear that you can quickly and unerringly attribute a particular cyber attack to a particular country, it's very difficult to go into a process of sanctions and everything else. So how are you going to handle that? Now, of course, like-minded countries can get together, and you mentioned some instances where they can give a certain momentum to this process by coming together, developing certain kind of norms, developing certain benchmarks, which itself then becomes a pressure point on other countries to come in and participate and observe those norms and codes of conduct. But the problem is that really powerful countries, which you have in mind when it comes to these issues, if they are not on the same plane as United States and others with regard to some of the issues you've mentioned, then how are you going to handle? Then you're going to have two sets of countries, like-minded countries, which will tend to be democratic countries, which are far more sensitive to these issues, far more sensitive to what the public demands, what the public expectations are, the role of all the people you mentioned, the private sector, the academia, the civil society, etc., etc. But the other countries you have in mind who do not have these considerations, so how are you going to then bring them into a larger process? Are you going to build up more and more confrontation? Or have you got to find some middle way by which they can be included in the process, but in a more meaningful manner? Not in terms of what you said just now about Russia not cooperating and China cooperating more, because China has far more to lose in its relationship with the United States than Russia has. And therefore, they have to be somewhat more receptive and open to US demands. And then there are all these issues of definitions and choosing areas of cooperation. Some of these, I know we've been associated together, Chris, in the East-West Institute. And there have been some progress in terms of dealing with Russia and China in some of these areas, but they remain essentially peripheral areas, and they have not gotten to the heart of the matter yet, because that consensus on the rules of the game has not yet been developed, including and especially relating to critical infrastructure. You mentioned the Geneva type of convention on cyberspace. Microsoft has come up with some kind of a proposal that they will take the lead in moving this in Geneva. I don't think that states will allow the private sector to take the lead in this. However well-intentioned it may be, will be seen as trying to preserve their commercial interests rather than anything else. Now, with regard to the multi-stakeholder concept, see, at one level, involvement of the private sector or industry or academia and civil society as equal partners may be attractive, but it is contestable. Because when it comes to domestic laws, domestic legislation, the representatives of the government and parliament in democratic countries consult all the stakeholders. And then it is up to them to pass the relevant laws. So the process is in two stages: consultation and then the jurisdictional part. But in this cyberspace, we want to bring in the multi-stakeholder concept. India supports that because the reality is that it will increasingly affect the lives of everybody. And we are caught in between, whereas at one level, we would think that it is for the states really to negotiate this. But we've found a middle way where we also support the multi-stakeholder process, because United States and others have been pushing for this, and our own public opinion is very much in favor of a multi-stakeholder process, so that the political level, the government is receptive to this idea. But there is a little flaw in this concept, as I mentioned, because it is assuming that democratic governments who come to the negotiating table have not done all the necessary consultations back home with all the stakeholders. But then the problem is, when the non-democratic countries come to the table, you're not sure whether they have done all the necessary consultation process back home. And you don't want to get into a situation where you leave it entirely into the hands of governments and then actually feed the worst instincts of the non-democratic governments and give them actually more arms to suppress freedom of expression and control over information within their own countries. So you have to tackle this issue too. Then finally, what should I say? I would say that all said and done, you have this problem at the international level that the states would want to play the dominant and primary role in discussing all this. And as I said earlier, and I'll repeat, that the thinking and approach of arms control and sanctions and everything else would actually complicate the process, because there will be resistance, and some powerful states will not easily accept to be dragooned into this, and you have other issues that will be rising up and will become part of another form of confrontation, because at the end of the day, the issue of internet governance is important, because we all talk about democracy, but the current system of internet governance is not democratic. It is essentially controlled by the United States of America, whereas the biggest consumers of benefits of cyberspace, the biggest markets, India is certainly one of them. Actually, the biggest market for Facebook in the world is India. And then we have seen how cyberspace can be very disruptive, can be actually a tool for terrorism and violence and social tensions and everything else. But since the international servers are not under the legal control of the government, then what do? How do we address this problem? And there are big issues involved here, because we've not been able to create a situation where the control over the internet is democratically distributed, because the argument against this is that it will become fractured, it will become divided, and the benefits will be lost, etc., etc. But this is a real issue at hand. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. This is my first time at this conference, and so far it's been such a great experience. And the previous panel, in particular, the things that were mentioned, that were discussed, was very stimulating. And perhaps I should focus on three or four things. First of all, I would just like to say that I'm from the government sector. I'm the only one. And I was glad to be reminded that Chris also was in the government sector. So I can tell you that Japan's basic position is more or less reflected in what he said. That's my first point. Secondly, I think there was some discussion about the inaneness of all this discussion about the applicability of international law and what the norms are in the in terms of cybersecurity. And I do agree on that to a certain degree. But I do think that the discussion needs to continue. And from my point of view, the applicability of international law itself is about deterrence. Some people like to call it demotivation. And it's also, I think, about public diplomacy as well. There's so many people, in Japan included, who simply believe that cyberspace is a lawless world. There's nothing that's ruling things. And all states can do anything that they want because there's nothing governing it. Our position is that the traditional international law can apply. Things can be tricky in terms of attribution, but that's the trickiness of applying how the international law can be applied. And since if one state actor is trying to inflict damage on another seriously, it can suffer some consequences. It's as simple as that. And I think that logic itself, which is embedded in as a principle throughout the application of international law, can apply to cyberspace as well. So this is the kind of message that we want to get across, not only to the states throughout the world, but to the people of the world as well. Thirdly, I would like to just say that since we're talking about multilateralism, what can we do from here? GGE, we didn't come to an agreement, of course, and we're discussing amongst different countries what we can do as our next step. But I think it's important to remember that time is against us, probably. I think in the previous discussion we heard about POPs. I found that to be very, very stimulating, and I think we need to factor that in. I think 5G is another one. I think China's been the main investor in 5G technology. So as we phase into 5G, there would naturally be more and more Chinese software and hardware. Can we actually accept that? Are we willing to face the risk? But as time is running, the risk, the degree of Chinese devices and software and hardware penetrating into each country's market will be greater and greater. Another aspect of time running out is the Chinese use of technology in terms of surveillance and censorship. And this is something that's not discussed that often, but I think we have to remember that with their experiments in their domestic market, which is huge, and they can gain so much technology from experiencing in their own market, that now they're able to export their own technology to the other countries who may be interested in using such technologies in the way that China is. It means that more authoritarian countries would be more susceptible to Chinese marketing on them. So as time passes, there's no doubt that there would be more countries using such technologies. I think Chris discussed that, and I think all the other participants discussed that it's important to work with the like-minded countries, and this is precisely the point. Will we have greater number of like-minded countries throughout the world? Oh, we know that G7 is going to work with us. We know that. US, Japan, absolutely, we're on the same side. But the other countries? Well, we'll just see. But as I mentioned, time is running out, and there will be progress made by our big neighbor. The last point I would like to mention is that we also need to remember the bigger context. And I think somebody mentioned about the grand plan, the grand design of China. There's no such thing. I tend to agree with that. But I think it's not about the grand plan or strategy. It's more or less about the mindset of a country. And China definitely is in a phase where their mindset gives them more confidence, it gives them more, it makes them more assertive, and they think that in every individual field that they can, their rules, their own norms can actually replace the traditional norms that we have built ourselves and believe in. And I think we're beginning to see that in all different spheres. It's not necessarily cyber. Cyber is one of them, but I think we're seeing that in human rights, religious rights. Are you free to choose your own leaders from the religious group's point of view? Can you actually, can Geneva conduct its business in the way it used to? We're seeing some new developments with China submitting some strange resolutions reflecting their own language used in their constitution. We're seeing some extraterritorial enforcement of some things. South China Sea is a very good example. And AIIB may be another example. So these are the kinds of things that China thinks. I don't think they're pretty much thought into whether they are right or wrong, but I think this is something that they believe in, and they have the momentum to push their ideas to the rest of the world. From our experience, we need to deal with that, definitely. And I do admit that China adopts a lot of pragmatism. And they are always testing the will of the rest of the world or of us. And if they find out that something that they're trying to do will face some resistance, very strong resistance, and they can be pragmatic in changing the course just a bit. Not the strategic changes, but tactical changes. That can add up to some things eventually. And I think what we saw with the U.S. in terms of espionage on intellectual property rights, I still think that's a very good example. I think when the timing is right, when the right actors are playing it right, I think it can make some difference. And within such a short period of time, from the U.S.-China agreement, it went to become a G20 agreement as well. We need to be creative. We need to work together. There may not be as many countries as I mentioned, but I think this is the only formula that I have. Anything more concrete? I'm afraid I don't have one at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So, great. You're saying actually that the situation is very complicated. We have to work very hard, be innovative, be creative. You mentioned the G7 and talking about President Trump. He's talking about the G8. That will change some statements, I think, regarding cybersecurity. Probably. The question of consensus, how should we work towards consensus? That's important, but it takes time. Do we have the time in cyber? And you all mentioned one way or another the issue of fragmentation, potential fragmentation of the networks globally. I would like to hear your opinion about what does it mean to you if that happens? If you're talking about like-minded, you're actually already pointing to the fact that like-minded countries should cooperate in a way. Maybe that should go even further and have connected networks. I don't think that's what you're meaning, but I'd like to hear your opinion about the potential for fragmentation of the global networks. Chris, why don't you start?
So I think some of that fragmentation has already happened, quite frankly. So it's not like we have a completely unified internet, but we need to try to prevent that fragmentation from happening further for very obvious commercial and social values. It's going to happen because different countries are going to try to draw borders around their cyberspace. Some have the ability to do it, others just don't. And I think China has a great firewall. They're doing other things to do this. Smaller countries don't do that, but I think this is part of the capacity building effort, where we have to win the hearts and minds of countries who are on the fence. There's lots of countries who look at the model that China puts forward, which is one of stability, and really championing stability over everything else. And frankly, I think that's pretty attractive. But they also want the kind of economic growth where they don't have China's economy, so we have to appeal to that as well. And I should also say that I'm not saying that when we do the like-minded approach, which I think is important, that means we abandon trying to engage with our frenemies or even the countries that we disagree with. Or I think we need to continue to have a structured dialogue around that. I think we need to continue to have activity in the UN. I think that we'll likely have another UNGG. I think that's a good thing. But that we also have to. We can't put all of our fruit in that basket. We can't think that that's going to pay off. As quickly as we needed to. So we also have to try to handle the instability by getting smaller groups too.
So I would fundamentally agree with the technical analysis that we've already had some level of fragmentation of the internet. There's a great paper out there by Bill Drake and Vince Cerf and others that analyzes this. But that's on a technical level. On a political level, I think it's an interesting question to pose because it's actually mostly the question that is dealt with within an internet governance environment and not the UN First Committee type environment that this discussion, for instance, is more focused on. And that actually helps us also conceptualize what's at stake here. So if we would actually take it to the logical extreme, and where we actually have a true fragmentation in the political context, where, for instance, the ICANN route is not adhered to anymore, but a separate route structure is developed, similar to what the BRICS-net has effectively proposed doing, then we also end up in a situation analyzing what is this going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years. Well, is that going to be an internet where, for instance, global notice and takedown policies are enforced across the internet, meaning that content control is made much, much easier than it is in the current internet? That would effectively mean we have two different types of societies. We have society in which the internet really is the control and stability instrument that China, Russia, and other countries wanted to create. And we have a non-state free market-driven internet on the other hand, where stability and security is an afterthought. But that also gets us back to what is the big picture here. And the big picture is not only the UN First Committee, arms control, and traditional military stability. It is effectively internet governance and the running of the domain. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that if we lose control over that aspect and that narrative, and we allow those advancing a multilateral narrative to succeed, then fragmentation is going to be the best way out for the rest of the world. Because this is the only way we'll be able to protect our own internet. Of course, that's going to leave hundreds of millions or billions of people trapped behind a great digital divide that may look, the Iron Curtain look like an afterthought.
Well, there are these contradictions that one has to deal with. There is this issue of digital divide, and as you say, if it gets fragmented and certain like-minded democratic countries gang up on one side and the others are left on the other side, then you have a problem. But I think there is a larger issue here. In this Cyber Week also, we've been talking about how the Internet of Things is going to totally change our lives, and is going to be across the board, all over the world. Even countries like China, who are seen as a problem currently in terms of cyberspace and the threats that they seem to be posing, are wanting to take the lead in this area and want to become the dominant technological power in this area. So how are they going to settle this issue? That on the one hand, they are going to be seen as a threat. On the other hand, the development of these technologies and profiting from them and the power equations that they wish to change through them needs interaction with the rest of the world. They're not going to sit at home inside their own borders and feel that they become powerful. So how are they going to resolve this contradiction? And what is it that we can do, the rest of the world can do, in terms of engaging them and putting them face to face with the kind of challenges that would lie ahead in terms of implementing their own vision 2030, 2050, or whatever it is, unless they become part of the larger game and participate more cooperatively in this regard. The other thing is that, two other things. One is that when we talk about like-minded countries, they may not be like-minded on every aspect. So that's where the issue is. So it's broadly, let's say India is now like-minded. We are a democracy country, to what was said earlier by a panelist, raised some doubts whether we are a democracy or not. But there are lots of things that we share with the United States and the Western world in terms of how we should approach this problem. But on some issues regarding internet governance, in the context of the problems that we have within our own country and the legal hurdles that we face in terms of actually genuinely dealing with these problems, which are extremely disruptive and pose huge threats of violence to our society, we are helpless because we are not able to have an arrangement or have a system under which we can legally have the power to control this kind of flow of information on the networks, and in fact oblige the Western companies to be more cooperative. So that is the second issue. The third is that apart from China or Russia, which are being seen as threats to cybersecurity, and who are great powers or have great power ambitions, and they look upon the cyber weapons as a means of power projection, etc., etc. I don't think the rest of the world is really in this game. I mean, which other country would Iran, maybe you might, in a certain specific context, may be seen as a problem, North Korea, but a very handful of countries which present the kind of dangers that we are talking about. So therefore, when we discuss this issue, it should not appear as if there is some kind of a new kind of divide that is happening between large sections of countries on one side and on the other. I don't think it's the case. It's just a few countries, and amongst them the most powerful are China and Russia, which are a problem. And therefore engaging them, finding some ways and means of bringing them on board through whatever means is possible, is a huge task ahead, because it also depends on the political relationship and the other differences that are there. And the capacity to engage them will depend also on resolving those differences rather than deepening them through other kinds of geopolitical and other actions which will make such cooperation difficult.
Thank you so much. this is the tricky issue, I think, for us. And I hope it didn't sound too pessimistic about it. Although there's some fragmentation happening already, I think we need to work on it, and maybe we can produce some results. I think the key area would be regional groups. And we are working with ASEAN countries through ARF, which also includes China and Russia as participants, actually. But there are some regional organizations. And as long as we look carefully into how their systems work, how their positions are they a true democratic country? How do they look at internet? Some countries look at the bigger countries as haves and reflect on themselves as not have countries. What sort of position are they? And I think they're all unique. And as long as you work carefully with each of the countries, you will be able to make some progress. We have actually made some progress in ASEAN, for instance. Maybe 2 years ago, there were not many countries interested in cybersecurity issues at all. Nowadays, we see more substance in the ASEAN statements on cybersecurity. And we are making a lot of difference. I think if you look at the Americas, OAS, they have started engaging some other countries on this, and we are seeing some results in the latest statements as well. Commonwealth countries, that's another good framework, and there may be other regional. Traditionally, it's been OSCE, but we know what the status is there. But there may be some other organizations that can prove to be productive, and as long as we work carefully, as long as we're not too pushy with the countries, I think there's a way to go.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. If there is any question from the audience, now is the time. Yes, please, go ahead. Just introduce yourself, please.
Federal Department of Finance, Switzerland. You mentioned the G20 process, and from the G20 process, there was a mandate to the FSB, Financial Stability Board, to do something about cybersecurity. And then there was the idea, okay, from some countries, let's do information exchange about attacks. That's so, because financial stability is at stake worldwide. If one is hit, everybody is hit, let's do it together. Now, from one side, that sounds very good, and we're ready to fight crime. But some attacks, like WannaCry, are state actors. So there, you're in national defense and not in fighting crime. And at the moment the attack happens, you do not know if it's crime or state, if it's crime or war. How do you tackle that on a multilateral level?
Great question. Who would like to take that? Chris.
So you're right. You don't know in the beginning often. You can often suss out by looking at some of the indicators who the actor is behind it, but you may not know. But I think what that means is you need to have within countries a whole of government approach to this. So you need to have not just the law enforcement authorities, but you have to have all the authorities, the defense authorities, the financial authorities, the commercial authorities, all talking very frequently. And then figuring out what kind of information you can share. And include, if it's a state actor, we had Iran attack our financial institution websites back a number of years ago. We were in constant contact with the private sector on that. Even though it was a state actor, we were still working with them. So I don't think just because it's a state actor means you can't share information between countries and between the private sector. One of the big challenges in this space, though, is I think figuring out how to share information quicker and get over some of the classification issues so that we can do it in a more appropriate way. Because if you're going to try to take action, either remedial action to try to prevent and respond to attacks, or imposing costs, you have to do a better job of that.
Just for clarifying, if I report that very fast to the G20 or to the FSB, and one proxy of this attacker is within the network, I'm revealing what my defense against this attack is.
Well, there are ways. I mean, there are ways to use existing organizations like Certs and other national level Certs. so you don't reveal those vulnerabilities. I mean, that's the reason you'd want to do it. And you'd want to share that information very quickly, I think, and use those existing organizations, and even strengthen those existing organizations. And I should also say, when you say FSB, you mean FSB in terms of the Financial Stability Board, not the FSB, right?
Anybody else want to respond to this?
I think you're talking about the day-to-day responses, but maybe I can shed some light on some of the things in terms of G20 as well. I think recently we had some big incident on cryptocurrency in Japan, and I think Japan has had a regulatory framework on cryptocurrency exchanges actually from 2017, and we were one of the few countries, maybe the first country to actually to do that. There was some recommendation under FATF, but now we're discussing amongst the like-minded countries whether we should elevate the level of enforcement on that and make it mandatory for the FATF countries to actually make that, put that the framework into place. This is the kind of discussion that's taking place in response to some of the terrible things happening in the cyberspace. In that sense, I think G20 and other groups are actually functioning well.
Question over here?
Ministry of Defense. You described a lot of interaction between states, but in this sector, the private sector is a huge player. The Amazons, the Facebooks, the Alibabas of the world. How do you interact with these players into coercing them or to cooperate them into doing something useful?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it's a reality-based question of how do we actually do cyber defense. And there was something called, for instance, Configure, which hopefully some of you are familiar with, which was a very dangerous botnet that nobody really knew where it came from, and which required a huge effort to take down. The effort was largely by companies in the private sector, and the government involvement on that level was described as no input, no knowledge, no effect. The government was not able to do very much in combating this particular cyber attack, and many other cyber incidents similar are going to be solved purely by the private sector and by the civil society organizations that support them. And the way it really works, as an information security practitioner myself, is it's usually conducted through informal networks. So the Computer Emergency Response Team, for instance, in Israel, will reach out to other certs and either formally do a transaction of information, but much more likely will informally exchange information with people who happen to have the right information at the right time, and will support them in defense. So it comes down to a couple of factors. First of all, who do you know? Second of all, how well are you liked? And third, how good are you at doing your job, which gives you currency and effectively investing in those relationships. For instance, in Europe, there's something called the European Government Cert Group, which is outside of the control of the EU, despite the EU's best attempts. And the reason why is that even for states, it's important to have informal networks to conduct this type of exchange. So European Government Cert Group is probably the most important group in defending Europe against cyber attacks, and has nothing to do with the EU. And it actually is not even really constrained within a legal agreement, but it's an informal agreement. And there are similar agreements across the information security community that effectively work to protect most of cyberspace on a day-to-day level. That's why I found it particularly amusing at a UNIDIR meeting about 2 years ago, where a Russian participant said that, I don't really know why we need this information exchange stuff, because if something really bad happens on the internet, we have now the special agreement with the United States. We just call up the United States and we'll take care of it, which is great, because I guess in 99% of the cases, either it won't be something that either Russia or the United States will want to own up to, or that they can actually address within a government context. So it comes down to effectively many, many informal networks, which I would agree, although I'm not a lawyer, is not a stable basis upon which to work, especially it puts a lot of people who do information security at risk of prosecution. But it's at the moment the only thing we have, and the currency for that is trust. And that is actually what everybody should be investing to as a matter of principle anyway.
Well, I don't know about Alibaba or Amazon, but with Facebook, we've had issues because Facebook is a very powerful medium for spreading propaganda or fake news or inciting violence or mobilizing crowds politically to take up certain issues, which then create social tensions. Yes, the process of persuading Facebook to take out some objectionable material is not as quick as it should be. And on occasions, Facebook makes the argument that according to their norms, such posting on it is not objectionable, and therefore they resist deleting it. And then there are now these privacy issues that have come up, and data localization and everything else. So this is the point I was making earlier also, that how can one legitimately, not with a view to controlling the flow of information within the country or denying access to information to your own public, but purely from a legitimate law and order situation, how do you get the social media giants to cooperate with you, and is there a legal framework which is effective, which is efficient, and which gives you the kind of solutions that you want to your problem in an adequate timeline. This is the issue that remains, which is why, while at a broad level, at least in India, we subscribe to most of the positions that the United States and others would take on this issue, but on this particular problem, and there are some others, on this particular problem, we've not yet been able to resolve it satisfactorily.
I would just add there's something called the USA Cloud Act, or the US Cloud Act, which is supposed to help address some of these issues. Yes, a lot of the data is stored in the US now. That's not going to be true forever. And the Cloud Act allows access in certain situations, but it does require much more negotiation going forward.
I would just like to mention that I think there's a greater sense of urgency to work with the private sector on the government side, at least in Japan, and I think shared by many countries as well. We talk about the vulnerabilities, bot cleansing, or IoT standardization, or supply chain integrity. All these things will involve the private sector, and these are very delicate matters as well. And that's why there's a lot of discussion taking place. But this can be done only with the full involvement of the private sector.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent contributions.